Hey there folks, welcome to Module 2 of the Microsoft MD-101 course. If this is your first video you're watching in this course, I'd recommend you first go and check Module 1 unless there's something specific you're looking for in this video. Well folks, as you can see, this module is called Implement Device Enrollment, and it will for the most part be about devices you can manage and how you can go about actually enrolling them into your company's environments. Now, speaking of what this module will be about, on the agenda is 3 main sections. These are simply the main sections covered and definitely not all the actual topics covered in this course. If you'd like a better idea of what the actual topics covered in this course, or more specifically in this module are, you can find that in the video description down below. And I did add a couple of timestamps there for you guys for your convenience, so you can go and skip ahead to those topics if you need to. Alright, so what are the 3 main sections on the agenda? The first one would be Manage Device Authentication. The second is Enroll Devices using Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager. Lastly, the third one is Enroll Devices using Microsoft Intune. There you have it, folks. The 3 main sections we'll be covering. Now, if any of you do decide to go peek at the topics covered in the video description, just note that I might have missed 1 or 2 in that list, so it's not an exact science. So for the most part, I'll give you a more or less spitball idea, but there is the possibility that 1 or 2 might have been missed. Now, before I go ahead and jump into the first section here, folks, if you haven't done it already, do your homie a favor and bump that like button. Don't be a weenie. Also, if you would like to know when I release other videos, for example, the next module to this course, then maybe consider subscribing, otherwise you might miss it. Well, now that I have my selfless promo out of the way, let's jump into the first main section, which is called Manage Device Authentication. So within this first section, the first topic we'll be discussing is Azure AD Join. The AD, of course, stands for Active Directory. So the first point of discussion I would like to add here for you folks is Windows can join Azure AD and ADDS. Now for the folks not familiar with some of those terminologies, Azure AD is the cloud Active Directory. That's the new one that's now in the cloud. And ADDS is the one you would normally have on premises. So ADDS is short for Active Directory Domain Services, and it's essentially a role you would go and add to a server on premises. That server would be physical, it could be virtual, and when you add that role to a server on premises, you are effectively giving that server a role to play. And when you add that role, you are installing what is known as the Active Directory software. That is the software that houses the user accounts, the groups, the group policies, the organizational units, which are known as OUs for short, basically just a fancy name for a fancy folder. But yeah, so what do we mean by Windows can join Azure AD and ADDS? Now, normally, traditionally, in the old days, if you want to go and join something to a domain, that device had to be a Windows device. Not just that though. You had to have the right edition of Windows. If we're talking about Windows 10 or Windows 11, that would be something like Professional or Enterprise. If you did not have Windows, and if it was not the right edition of Windows, you would not be able to join that device to a domain. So this was very much limited to laptops and desktops in a nutshell. That's if we look at the old ADDS scenario, which is the Active Directory was on premises. Now, if you look at Azure AD, the one in the cloud on the Azure platform, that's the new one. I know that's not the actual topic, but you're not just limited to Windows devices. You can now actually go and join any device. It doesn't have to be a laptop or a desktop. It can be a tablet or a phone. These devices don't have to have Windows installed. They can have Android installed. It can be iOS. And if you have Windows installed, it doesn't have to be enterprise or professional. This can be a home or a basic edition of some kind. So that is one of the benefits of Azure AD versus the on-premises one. On-premises was limited to Windows devices, which for the most part, let's face it, will be tablets and desktops. Where the Azure AD is not limited to Windows devices, which means it's not limited to laptops or desktops. These could be phones or tablets. It's definitely not limited to the edition. So that's a major benefit in my books. So that brings us to the second point of discussion here, which I did technically cover just a moment ago. Most non-Windows devices, which is now obviously going to be tablets and phones for the most part, can join the Azure AD, but not the on-premises Active Directory, which is known as ADDS. So if you would like to join your phones and tablets, or your client or your customer would like to do that, then they will have to make use of Azure AD, and those devices can only join the Azure AD. If you would like to join your on-premises Active Directory, that, however, will unfortunately be limited to laptops and desktops running Windows, and this is obviously subject to them running the right edition of Windows. Now, let me give you guys a couple of typical scenarios for joining a device to Azure AD. So why would you want to go and do something like that? There's many reasons, but I'll give you a couple. So if applications and resources that you use are mostly in a cloud, that could be a reason to go and join a device to your Azure AD. Because if you join those devices to your Azure AD, you as the administrator have control over who can access resources in the cloud and to what extent they can access the cloud. So I can basically go and say which devices or who is allowed to go and access what. So if I've got applications in the cloud or just general resources being stored in the cloud, I can go and choose exactly which devices or exactly which accounts can go and access those resources and to what extent and when and all that kinds of stuff. This could also be if you want to separate temporary accounts. Now, on premises, this was a bit of a schmackadoodle back in the day. So generally, you will go and create accounts on your on-premises Active Directory in the old days. This was for everybody, for people that's working for you permanently, as well as people that's coming into your organization temporarily, like consultants or contract workers. Then we started looking at registering people's devices, which was also a bit of an issue. Now, on the cloud Active Directory, being your Azure Active Directory here, you do not need to go and create a full-blown Active Directory account on your Active Directory for people that's not actually part of your company full-time. So if and when you or your client has contract workers or consultants that need access to certain resources for a certain period to a certain extent, you can actually now go onto the Azure portal and you can go and make what is known as a guest account. That is to give account access to someone that's outside your company. So you can go and invite these folks with the live ID. Live IDs these days are also known as online accounts. They're also known as Microsoft accounts. Now, these days, 9 out of 10 companies are using what is known as Microsoft 365. And these email addresses or accounts in 365 are actually seen as live IDs. So 9 out of 10 times, you can literally just go and invite these folks using their work email addresses, and that's going to be more than sufficient. Now, in this situation where this person or persons that you're trying to invite to your company does not have 365, which I find very unlikely, these people could literally just go to www.live.com and just go and make themselves a new live ID. Or you can just use their existing live ID if they happen to have one. So just type in the work email or their live ID, invite them as guests, and once you've done that, you can go and choose what level of access these folks will have in your company and to what extent. Lastly, guys, another scenario I want to give you is if you want to enable users to join their device to the corporate network. Now, for the most part, this is going to be your own staff members, your own people in your own company. So if folks have their own devices, this is probably going to be a BYOD situation, which stands for bring your own device. So if one or more people have their own phone, their own tablet, their own laptop, whatever it might be, and they would like to go and join that to your company domain for whatever reason, you can have them do that now if you're using Azure Active Directory. If you were looking at an on-premises Active Directory environment, that could only be done if it's a laptop or desktop. If it's a tablet or phone, it wouldn't work. And even if it is a laptop or a desktop, they had to have the right edition, a whole bunch of other nonsense. These days, it's a lot easier and a lot more convenient to allow people to go and join your Azure AD. Now, with that being said, I am going to mention a word of caution here. Don't just allow people to just join the devices willy-nilly to your environment. Even though it is theoretically possible for them to do that, you'll find the average company will go and put in some sort of compliance policies of sort, which basically means these devices that's going to be joined to your company domain, they have to meet certain criteria first. And the main one that you want to look at is security. So if people want to go and join their own devices to your company in Active Directory environment, they need to meet certain criteria for security. This could be to force these people to have a minimum of an 8-character password. If they don't have a password, it's not going to work. If the password's not long enough or not complex enough, it's not going to work. You can, for example, force these people to have encryption on the devices. You can, for example, force these people to run a certain operating system or a certain version or edition of an operating system. You can force them to be in a certain location, geographically speaking. We normally do that with public IPs, in case you're wondering. So there's a lot of criteria you can go and specify, T's and C's, if you will. And if your people, your members, your users, whatever you want to call these people, if they don't meet that criteria, they will not be able to join your domain, or at the very least, they will not be able to access company resources until they meet that criteria. Now, when it comes to joining devices to the domain, you can join devices to the Azure Active Directory during the initial setup, or you can do it later by using system settings. And when we say system settings, we actually refer to the settings app. So if you go to your start button on Windows 10 or Windows 11, somewhere you're going to find settings. It just normally says settings. Where exactly is it going to depend on whether we're talking about Windows 10 or 11. So on Windows 10, as soon as you click on start at the bottom left, somewhere at the bottom left, there's something that says settings. That'll open what is known as the settings app. On Windows 11, you'll find your start button is somewhere in the middle of your taskbar, and it's going to open a menu in the middle of your screen, and you just look for the settings icon. Either way, potato, that is known as the settings app. And in that settings app, normally somewhere around in the about section, you will have the ability to join that device to the domain. That's now obviously provided that it's a Windows device. If we're talking about the settings app, we are referring to Windows devices. Lastly, hybrid Azure AD Join is a process to automatically register your on-premise domain join devices with Azure AD. So if you would like your device to automatically be joined to that situation, then sure, you can go make use of hybrid Azure AD. But if you don't want certain devices to be automatically registered for whatever personal reasons you or your company might have, you can actually go and opt to go and do this manually later. Although most of the companies I've dealt with, in my personal experience, would just leave this on the default. Now, if any of you folks are not familiar with what the term hybrid means, that is when you've got something in the cloud. Well, in a nutshell, it's when you've got something in the cloud and on premises at the same time. And in this case, we're talking about Active Directory. So this is a company that has Active Directory on premises. It's 10 to 1 going to be their old traditional one, which they've had for the last 10 or 20 years, if not longer. And at the same time, this company or organization now has opted to get themselves Azure Active Directory in the cloud on Microsoft's Azure portal. And they have now synchronized these two Active Directories of one another. So what we're saying here is they've got Active Directory in the cloud, and at the same time, they still have their old traditional Active Directory on premises, and these two are now synchronized. You can now go and create an account on premises or in the cloud. It's your choice how you want to go about it. If you want to do it on premises, you can do the old school way that you've always used. In a cloud, you'll have to normally log on to the portal and go into the Azure Active Directory, and then of course go and do it there. Whichever method you or the user decides to go and make use of, essentially what's going to happen is that change that happens will get synchronized at some point in time. When that gets happened or when that gets synchronized, I can't tell you because it depends on how often you've set the scheduler to go and synchronize. All right, folks, let's move on to the next topic, Azure Active Directory Join prerequisite limitations and benefits. So first of all, to join a Windows device, notice I said Windows, the device registration service must be configured to enable you to register devices. In addition to having permission to joining devices in the Azure Active Directory tenant, you must have fewer devices registered than the configured maximum. So this whole Azure Active Directory join concept is intended for organizations that want to be cloud first. So in other words, primarily use cloud services with the end goal to reduce the use of on-premises infrastructure in a nutshell. Or to, well, be cloud only. So they're either going to be using some level of on-premises resources, but they want to have that like on a back burner, and their intention is actually to move away from the on-premises infrastructure, or they are completely in the cloud. So that is when and why people would mainly go and use Azure Active Directory Join. And I suppose it's also a little bit of, maybe these people are using devices that's not Windows. I mean, that would personally be a reason for me. It's not a real reason in the course, but, for me personally, I would use that as a reason as well, to go and join devices to Azure. Because we said earlier, Windows devices, if you want to join them on premises, that's the only one you can join on premises. If you want to join something that's non-Windows on premises, yeah, it's not going to work. So if you look at something like the cloud, you can join anything pretty much to the cloud. It doesn't have to be Windows. And with so many people working in so many locations of so many kinds of devices and operating systems these days, yeah, I can't see that, moving into the cloud will be the only reason for you to go and join Azure Active Directory. It could also be because of the kinds of devices your people are using, the operating systems they're using, and where these people are actually based at. Anyway, just to add a couple of random points here that also needs to basically be thrown into this category according to Microsoft. Multi-tenancy is very difficult to implement with ADDS. You'd remember ADDS, that's the role you would install on premises on an on-premises server to give you Active Directory. And the on-premises one, although it's got many benefits, also has many limitations. Like we said, can only join laptops and desktops, has to be Windows, has to be the right edition of Windows. So it's very difficult to have multiple tenants on premises. But if you look at something like the cloud, more specifically like Azure Active Directory, you can go and have multiple tenants. It's actually designed like that in the beginning. So if you are a huge company that's got sub companies, in other words, they're under your umbrella, you can manage them all on the same platform, each with their own unique tenant. There's many reasons why I have more than one tenant, but that's one example I'm just sucking out of my thumb. Azure Active Directory is not part of the core infrastructure. This is now all in the cloud. So it's all Microsoft's problem, or whoever the cloud provider's problem is, whoever the cloud provider is. In this case, it's Microsoft. It's all in the cloud. It's all managed in the cloud. It's for the most part, someone else's responsibility. You just get to, for the most part, reap the benefits. Azure Active Directory is an example of platform as a service. Azure Active Directory does not have the same management capabilities as Active Directory domain services on premises. So in some aspects, you can actually do a little bit more. In some aspects, you can actually do less. So when I say more, I mean you can join different kinds of devices now, different operating systems, all that. But from a management capability, the actual tools that you have to your disposal as the administrator, that you probably can do slightly less in certain aspects, but in other aspects, you can do kind of more, because now you can go and enforce things like Windows Hello. We're basically forcing people to use some sort of biometric locks. You can go and force people to use multi-factor authentication, all kinds of cool jazz like that. And then lastly, as I said earlier, Azure Active Directory is multi-tenant by design. So if you are a company that's part of a bigger umbrella, or you've got a bunch of smaller entities or smaller companies under your umbrella, you can have it all in the same Active Directory, just each of their own little tenants, so to speak. All right, and then folks, let's talk about joining devices to the actual Azure Active Directory. So I think we've said a lot about that already, but that's mainly what this module is about. We know if we talk about the Azure one in the cloud, you can join any device. It's not limited to Windows. It's not limited to laptops and desktops like on premises for the most part. So if it's Windows, it can be any edition, unlike on premises. So first of all, joining a device to Azure Active Directory is a simple procedure. Doesn't really matter what device operating system it is. Secondly, you can join to the Azure Active Directory after the Windows installation, assuming of course you're using Windows, or it can be done later at any time using the settings pane. So that second point, I just want to point out once again, this is now, of course, if we're talking about Windows. If we're talking about Windows, you can do it during the Windows installation. You'll find with Windows 10, especially Windows 11 nowadays, while you're doing the installation, it's going to actually prompt you or the person that's doing the installation whether you want to go and join some sort of domain, like an Azure Active Directory domain more specifically. Or you can say, I want to skip this and I want to do it later. And later, at some point in time, if you or the user in question wants to go and join some sort of Azure domain, you can simply go to the settings pane and you can go and do it from there. And then third point I want to add here, which is the last one for this topic, you need Azure Active Directory credentials to join the device to the Azure Active Directory. This is very important, guys. That's a question exam. I can't guarantee that you guys will get that, but if anyone needs to go write the MD-101 certification exam, there's a very good chance you may possibly get this as a question in the exam. And it's pretty much for the same reasons as on premises with an old school on premises Active Directory. We just don't want any weasel and his uncle to be able to go and join whatever device they want to go and join. So if someone, even if they are part of my organization, even if they are an employee or a member, they should theoretically not be able to just go and join any device willy-nilly to my environment. So there's a lot of companies out there, actually quite frankly most companies, that prefer for the users to only use company-owned devices. Now, if you don't have credentials, some guy and his uncle can very easily just go and join some random device to your company's organization and access resources. This is bad for many reasons. From a security standpoint, that's bad because they could very easily hijack company information, steal it if need be. This also is a security risk in the sense of that device that are joining to the company domain could not have possibly the same level of protection as the company assets. Maybe it's not encrypted, maybe it doesn't have the complexity requirements when it comes to passwords, all kinds of stuff like that. So companies prefer for people to go and use company assets because company assets generally are seen as more secure and we generally have more control over those company assets. All right, let's talk about managing devices that are already joined to your Azure Active Directory. So group policy manages devices that join on-premises Active Directory domain services. So group policy is something we've had for probably decades by now. And if any one of you guys are familiar with group policies, you probably know already. Group policies allows you as the administrator to go and configure over 3,000 settings on someone's machine. Now you can either go and do this locally on a machine individually, but nobody does that because there's no real reason to go and do it like that. Or you can go and configure something in group policies on a server and push that out to a lot of devices in one go. Now that's normally how we go and do it, but why do we go and do it? So a lot of people are under the impression group policies are used to go and turn things off or to go and block things. Now, I wouldn't say that's not true. Yes, you can go and turn things off, and yes, you can go and block things, but that's absolutely not the only thing group policy is used for. In general, group policy can be used to turn things on or off, block things, allow things, tweak things, configure things. So this could be something as simple and as common as just changing people's devices' wallpaper, maybe. Maybe I just want to change the wallpaper of everybody's laptop or desktop to the company logo. And instead of me going to each and every machine in my company, I could just go and configure a group policy and push that out to all the devices which says change the wallpaper to the following. So this could be for many things. Like I said, over 3,000 settings. Now, unfortunately, group policy is not always available or supported for devices that join the Azure Active Directory. So yes, Azure Active Directory gives us many benefits, but there's also one or two things that you lose, and one of those things is group policies for the most part. There's a few other things you can go and use in its place, which is similar, but it's not quite exactly the same thing, which is why some companies tend to stick with what we know as a hybrid Active Directory environment. So that gives them the benefits of both worlds. You get all the new extra goodies and benefits from the Azure Active Directory, but at the same time, you get to keep all the benefits from your traditional on-premises Active Directory. A drawback to a hybrid Active Directory, at least in my personal opinion, is the fact that it's not saving you money. You're in fact paying more because now you're paying for a subscription for the stuff online, and at the same time, you have to still maintain everything you still had on premises. You're actually losing money in that regard, in my opinion. But if you ignore the money factor here, you're just winning all the way. You're getting the benefits of both worlds here. Something else you guys need to be aware of with regards to group policies at least is group policies is a Microsoft Windows things. So if we look at something like an Android operating system or iOS from Apple, anything like that, those platforms couldn't care less about Microsoft in their group policies. So if you've got people in your company that's using Android devices or Apple devices or whatever the case might be, group policies is not going to work on those devices. So that is why some companies out there will actually force their users to use a Windows phone or a Windows tablet because then they can, to a certain degree, force down group policies onto those devices. Now, I've seen these days companies are doing that less and less because there's other platforms out there like now Endpoint Manager, which is actually a topic in this course, or Intune. And using those platforms, you can go and enforce things like compliancy policies and whatnot, which is very similar to group policies, Not exactly the same thing, but you can in certain cases achieve more or less the same goals here. Anyway, Azure Active Directory supports integration of mobile device management applications such as Intune. So Intune is not the only example of this, but it is an example of an MDM, which is short for mobile device management. So that is essentially a platform that allows you to manage phones and tablets. At least that's what it was originally designed for. So for those of you who don't know, Intune was originally designed to manage phones and tablets. It's absolutely not the only thing we use it for these days. You can use it to manage laptops and desktops and a whole bunch of other things as well. You can use Intune to see what hardware people have, what devices they have, what operating systems they have on those devices, what editions they have, what versions they have. You can go check the software they've got installed, the drivers they've got installed, updates they've got installed. There's a whole bunch of information you can basically pull from these people's devices. I actually want to go as far as to say you can see almost anything regarding these people and the devices. But there's a catch to that. Because at this point in time, it kind of sounds like hacking. So in general, these devices need to be enrolled into a company's Intune environment first before you can go and pull all this information and manage those devices. Up until now, I've just mentioned things you can see, but in reality, you can actually also do. So never mind seeing all of that stuff, I can actually go and deploy updates and drivers as well, and programs and all that. I can also go and remove updates, drivers, and programs. Heck, I can even go and remote wipe people's devices if I feel it's necessary. Anyway, so when integration between Intune and Azure Active Directory has been configured and established and all that, a device that joins the Azure Active Directory will automatically be enrolled in Intune, assuming you've now configured all of this and set this up. So that's just once again another method to make your life a little bit easier and to make your workload a little bit less. So if I go to someone's machine or I remote connect to someone's machine or I help them over the phone or whatever the case might be, and we eventually ultimately get this device joined to the Azure Active Directory, that device could actually be automatically enrolled into Intune. And if it's now automatically enrolled into Intune, guess what? I can now pull information about that device. It doesn't matter what the device is. It doesn't matter where it is. As long as it's got an internet connection, I can pull information about it and I can actually essentially manage it. So there you go, guys. A little bit about Intune. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let's move on to our second main section in this module, which is enroll devices using Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager. The first topic we've got in this section is deploy the Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager client. Now, in case you guys don't know what that is, it used to be called Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager. So now we just refer to it as the Endpoint Configuration Manager. So it's basically a new name. And if you know what it does, which I'm sure you will probably soon at the end of this module, then you'll understand why they probably went and renamed it. So this is one of the tools we administrators use to go and manage our users and to manage their devices. Unfortunately, it is for the most part limited to on-premises. So if you want to manage people and the devices on premises, then on Endpoint Configuration Manager is probably the way to go about it. If you want to manage your users and the devices that's not on premises, if they're remote or in the cloud or wherever the case might be, then you would go and use something called Intune, which is also a topic in this course. Now, if you're wondering, can you combine these two or use them both at the same time? Yes, you can. You can most certainly go and combine these two. You can most certainly use them both at the same time. That would be an example of co-management. All right, so what does this course include, or more specifically this module? It includes Microsoft's Endpoint Configuration Manager, which is the main topic of this specific section. That is a tool we would normally go and use on premises. So it's an on-premises solution. So if your users and the devices are for the most part just on premises, this is the tool you would go and use. If they're always on premises and fully on premises, I suppose one might say you don't actually even need Intune. I mean, there's no rule that says you can go and get it. I mean, there's many benefits you'll get with both of these. So if you go and use them both, well, the better for you. Now, this also includes Microsoft Intune. Intune, like I just mentioned a couple of moments ago, that is a cloud tool for Microsoft. Used to be a platform completely on its own, and then somewhere between 2019 and 2020, Microsoft decided to go and import or migrate us into the Azure portal. So you're going to have to go into the Azure portal, you're going to have to go to Intune there, and there you'll essentially be able to manage your users and their devices and all that. So this is a cloud-based solution. You as the administrator, you can be anywhere in the world, and your users and their devices can be anywhere in the world. Now, so both of these tools, you can manage your people, you can manage the devices. And if I just go ahead and say, hey, you can manage any user and any device pretty much anytime, that kind of sounds like hacking. So to prevent this from being hacking, and I might have said this earlier in this video already, for the endpoint manager, you normally need to go and install or drop a client, more commonly referred to as an agent. With regards to Intune, these devices normally need to be enrolled into your company's Intune environment. So you can think of this as giving permission. So all my company assets would have this client or agent installed or drop on them, and that's going to allow me to go and manage them using Endpoint Configuration Manager. When it comes to Intune, once I've enrolled these devices in question into the Intune environment, I can essentially go and do the same thing. So with all of that being said, we can say modern deployment does not mean only cloud solutions. I think Endpoint Configuration Manager is a very good example of that. It's still a very popular tool, a very widely used tool, and for the most part, it's used on premises. So that is a very good example that modern management or modern deployment is not necessarily just cloud solutions. Now, for the people that are existing Configuration Manager customers, the old platform, you can migrate workloads or facilitate new capabilities in Intune that offer a benefit. So there is that factor. And please don't migrate workloads for the sake of migration. A lot of people are under the impression that, hey, I must probably go and migrate now. No. There is a pretty good chance you might not even need to go and migrate. Normally, when people go and release new platforms, like in this case, Endpoint Configuration Manager, they try and make it as seamless as possible and as convenient and as easy as possible for the customers, the users, which is now obviously us administrators. Right, let's talk a bit about monitoring the Endpoint Configuration Manager client. So after you've installed the Configuration Manager client on the Windows device or devices and are connected to your site, you can essentially monitor and manage the devices directly inside the Configuration Manager console. It's designed to be simple that way, guys. If you folks go and play with the Configuration Manager, you'll find that there are actually a number of built-in features you can use to alert you or show you a status of what's going on, what issues could be experienced in your network, what issues your devices are experiencing or users are experiencing. So there's many alerts. I'm going to list a couple for you guys, but in reality, there's many. So those alerts and those status reports are there to make your life easier and to give you a better overview of what the heck is going on in your environment, what is going on with your users, what is going on with those devices, so that you can go and proactively assist them and fix any issues that, I don't know, could become a bigger problem later down the line. Anyway, so what are these alerts or, well, statuses? So that could be something like client online status. The site considers a device online if it's connected to its assigned management point. To indicate that the client is online, it basically needs to send a ping-like message to the management point. If that management point does not receive a message within 5 minutes, the site considers the client offline. You can kind of think of this as a bunch of people at a sleepover party. I know it's a weird example, but I'm thumb sucking here. So if you or your homies or your mates or your friends are at the sleepover, maybe while you're all lying in bed, you're all chatting with one another because you're all buddies, you're all friends and whatnot. And from time to time, some of you guys might start dozing off. And if someone gets quiet, you're going to call out the person's name. If they respond, then you know, okay, cool. This bra is still awake. They're still with us. But if you call someone's name out and they do not respond, that could be an indication that the person has fallen asleep. In other words, they're no longer with you. So it's not the best example, but it's kind of the same thing. So you can think of that as a client online status. If someone doesn't respond, well, then obviously they're offline. Anyway, another alert you'll find, or should I say status, is client activity. So with the client activity status, the site considers the client active if it has communicated with the configuration manager in the past 7 days. This is very similar to the previous studies where we just explained, except that this one, it is called activity to check if something is active at all. And this is measured over 7 days, like I said. The site considers the client inactive if it hasn't done certain actions within 7 days. This could be things like requesting a policy update. It could be sending a heartbeat message, if you guys know what that is. Heck, it could even be sending hardware inventory. So, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do with Endpoint Manager and with Intune. And one of those things is to go and check the hardware inventory. So if this device is not sending its inventory within 7 days, that's a little odd. All right, moving on our list of alerts, or should I say statuses, you also get primary user. So this one from the Endpoint Configuration Manager console, you can see at a high level what Configuration Manager believes to be the primary user of this device. This metric is calculated over a 60-day period of most frequent logins. So obviously in that period, whoever signs in the most and the most frequently, that usually tends out to be the most primary user. We just call it the primary user. We also have operating system build. There is a lot of data you can pull from users and devices, and the operating system build is just one of those many things. You can see exactly which operating system version someone or something is running and exactly what build, which is the actual topic there. There's a lot of other things you can also see, mind you, but yeah, those are not listed here right now by Microsoft. And of course, I'm just mentioning it to you folks as an extra so that you at least are aware of it. So that when you go into the field, you know that what I've listed here is not the only things you can go and view, and it's not the only things you can go and pull. There's a lot more you can see, a lot more information you can pull from devices. Anyway, another alert or status you folks will find is one called client check. This has to do with the periodic evaluation that Configuration Manager does. Basically, how often it runs, when it runs, if it runs at all even. Some folks turn this off though in some cases, especially when it comes to servers. So if this thing does some sort of evaluation and it notices, oh heck, there's something wrong here, we do not necessarily want this thing doing an auto correction on something like a server, especially if it's a critical server. Can you imagine the level of damage that can cause? So maybe it's an issue on a critical server, but it's not an issue that we want it to do an auto correction on, because the auto correction could actually end up doing more damage. So depending on what this is on, so if it's something like a critical server, you might want to have it just inform you of the issue, not do an auto correction, and then later when it's safer to go and do it, you or your fellow staff members can go and do the auto correction manually, of course. Alrighty, moving on to our next topic here, folks, which is now managing the Endpoint Configuration Manager client. Okay, so when the Configuration Manager client installs on a device and successfully assigns it to a site, you can and will see the device in the Assets and Compliance workspace in the Devices node. Once it's in there, the device is likely to join one or more collections from which to be actively managed from. I realize I might have mentioned a couple of terms and stuff which some of you folks might not find too familiar yet. Unfortunately, this course does get very deep very quickly. But I will try and fill in the blanks here and there where possible. So the client I spoke of that I've mentioned, that's a small little installation. It's a small little file that you go and drop and install on the devices that you intend on actually managing via Endpoint Manager, which was previously known as Configuration Manager. So Intune, you have to go and enroll the devices you want to manage. With Endpoint Manager, you've got to do a little client installation. That installation is what's going to allow you to see all the devices, what they are, where they are, what the specs are, all of that kinds of jazz. So yeah, once you've dropped or installed a little client file, that device that you've installed the client file for on, it will be listed under Assets and Compliance, since it's an asset. And in the Assets and Compliance console, or whatever you want to go and call it, dashboard, we call it the workspace, there is a little folder, if you will, that's called Devices. So they call it a node, Microsoft, but it's basically a fancy name for a fancy folder. And in the devices section, you will see that devices listed under devices. Now, anyway, speaking of terms and phrases and stuff you guys may or may not know, Something else you guys are going to hear of a lot, especially of Endpoint Configuration Manager, is collections. What the cheese is a collection? We're going to be hearing a lot of that. We're going to be talking a lot of that. So you can think of this as a logical grouping of things, a grouping of users or a grouping of devices. You can actually do the same thing on Intune. I believe in Intune it might be called something else. But on Intune, you can do the same thing. So I can go and make a collection of devices. So this could be a collection of all the tablets in my company. It could be a collection of all the laptops in my company. Maybe it's a collection of all the tablets in my company, but a specific make or model of tablets. Whatever your unique scenario is. If I need to go and deploy a configuration, a policy, a setting, or if I would like to go and pull information about a certain group of devices or pull information about a certain group of users, I can go and use these collections. So it's used to go and do configurations. It's used to go and deployments. It's used to pull information, a lot of things. I might have repeated myself there a couple of times, but you get the idea here. So if I need to go and do a deployment to a certain group of people, maybe the sales department, I can essentially go and create a collection called sales. It's a fancy term they use for a group. That's basically what it is. So if I want to go and deploy a new program, and this is maybe only relevant to the people in the sales department, I can now go and create myself a collection, maybe call it sales, and then I simply just go and choose that collection called sales, and I simply just go and deploy this program or whatever it might be to that collection called sales. Same can be done for devices. So if I need to go and install something, but this is for a certain group of devices, however you want to go and rearrange this, you simply just choose that group of devices and do the deployment to that group of devices. So what can we say about collections? It represents devices or users that have some commonality in Configuration Manager. In other words, they're in the same departments, the same brand, it's the same type of device. You can use collections to perform tasks such as target a deployment or run a report on devices in a collection. So if I want to go into deployment specifically on all my laptops, I simply go and make a collection called laptops or whatever you want to go and call it, and you go and do the deployment. If I want to do the deployment to a group of users, you just go and create a collection, give it a nice little name like sales if it's the sales department, and you go and do that deployment. Same goes for reports if you want to pull reports on certain groups of people or certain groups of devices. Now, guys, management options can apply to devices in a collection or individual devices. So we're talking about devices here. And when it comes to management options, you can do that obviously for a collection, like we just said. You guys have a fair understanding of what a collection is now. Or what you can go and do, which is very unlikely, you can go and apply this to an individual device. And I don't really see that happening because it's too much work. I mean, imagine for a moment you've got a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand users. Do you really want to go and apply some sort of policy or something to each and every device one by one? Heck no! I'm just going to throw them all into a collection, basically a fancy name for a group, like I said, and just do it from there. So why work harder when you can work smarter? Now, what are these management options? So there's quite a few. I'm going to mention four for you guys. One is Start Resource Explorer. Fancy name, but in a nutshell, it just comes down to viewing the inventory information about a device. So with that option, I can go and basically see what device this is. Is it a laptop? Is it a desktop? What is it? I can see, does it have an operating system installed? If so, what is it? Is it Windows? It's probably going to be Windows. What edition is it? What version is it? What build is it? I can go and pull other kinds of hardware information about this device. I can go and see how much RAM it's got, how much hard drive space it's got, what kind of CPU it's got. And that's important going forward because if you need to do some sort of deployment, you will need to know what kind of hardware these devices have. Because maybe someone doesn't have enough RAM to run the program that you are about to deploy to them. So you can go and do some sort of review first, just to go and double check what kind of devices these folks have. And if you find someone doesn't have the right device, you can have them bring in the device and you can go and upgrade it for them. Or better yet, maybe just swap it all together. Give them a better device. At least then you know the program is going to work. So this is very important when it comes to doing your planning, deployments, migration, all that. Another action we get is start policy retrieval. So this is to execute some of the previous client actions locally direct from the site server. So if you've run some actions previously, you can execute them directly on the site server. You also get an action called add to a collection. This will allow you to add the client directly to a collection, such as an installation collection from the object itself, and so on and so forth. So it's just once again another task that they've given you that you can go and make use of to make your life a little bit quicker and a little bit easier. So if I want to go and create a collection, a fancy folder in other words, or a fancy group called installation, I can go and add a client directly to that. You're just basically skipping the middleman or skipping a couple of steps here. Lastly, a client action you will get, this is the fourth and the last one I'm going to list for you guys, is client settings RSOP. So this is a straightforward one, basically just allows you to review current client settings for a given endpoint. So if you have a certain laptop or a certain desktop that you would like to go and review the settings for, maybe you've configured this like light years ago, ages ago. I mean, we get old, we can't always remember what we configured and where, or maybe someone else configured something on this endpoint. Whatever your unique situation might be, you can go and review those client settings just to give you a bit of a better idea of what the cheese is going on, what are the current settings on a device, and then maybe you'll find you might need to do a couple adjustments. You know, you never know. All right, folks, let's move on to our next topic, which is actually our last topic in section 2, and then we'll move on to our last section in this module. So our next section here, or not section, topic is client deployment options. All right, so just to recap, in case you did not watch the full video, because I know some folks just use timestamps. So the client we're talking about here is the small little setup file you're going to go and install on the actual devices that you want to go and manage. So how do we get that client file on those devices? Now, yes, you can go and take a memory stick slash flash drive or whatever you want to go and call it. And yes, you can go and drop it on there. And yes, you can go and plug it into the device in question and just install it manually, which ironically actually is one of the options. But what are the other ways to get it there? So one of these methods is called client push. This enables you to deploy the client directly from the Configuration Manager console. Devices can be discovered through various methods, but most often we just go and do it via Active Directory, and you'll find them via a particular OU. We'll go and locate them in the OUs and all that. So there's some sort of technicality in it. It's not rocket science, but you do need to have some sort of knowledge of Active Directory and what OUs are and all that before you can go and use this method. Once again, not rocket science. So if you are tasked with having to do this, maybe just get a little assistance from your Active Directory guys, assuming, of course, you've got those in your company. A second method you can go and make use of to get this cloud onto people's devices is manual deployment. Now, I think the name tells you everything you need to know. It's a manual deployment. So you can go and get the MSI file if you want to go and use that. It's basically equivalent of an exe file. But it generally just comes down to just manually installing the deployment, manually installing the client on one device directly. I don't see this one often. It is a common method, but it's not often, at least not in medium to large size companies. This is something you'll more often see in a very small company, but very small companies don't really use Endpoint Configuration Manager to begin with because it's too complex for them. It's too expensive for them. So if a small company were to go and use Endpoint Configuration Manager, then yes, they might go and do a manual deployment because of the amount of devices and people they've got. But more than likely, you're only going to find this Endpoint Configuration Manager in medium to large size companies. And medium to large size companies couldn't be bothered by doing a manual deployment. They'd much rather go and do this at a much larger scale. Now, speaking of larger scale, you can also go and make use of operating system deployment, better known as OS deployment for short. OS is just, well, short for operating system, but I'm sure you all know that already. This method is one of the most common ways to actually deliver the client. When installing and setting up Windows using a task sequence, you can actually slipstream the configuration client into the Windows setup and provide it with the necessary installation parameters. To use this method, though, the client must be installed when a device is built for the first time or, well, rebuilt. Therefore, it isn't appropriate for existing devices. I wouldn't recommend using this on an existing device. Lastly, guys, if you really want to, but this is not going to work for everybody, you could actually go and use Microsoft Intune, which is another topic in this course. I mean, we just spoke of trying to get the client on these devices. And if you'd like to manage devices of Intune, we've mentioned that earlier in the course, you need to enroll those devices in Intune. But if you're lucky enough, and this is a big if you are lucky enough to have devices that's already enrolled into Intune, but they're not yet being the keyword here, not yet managed by Endpoint Manager, you can actually go and use Intune to go and deploy that little client installation file, because Intune can be used for many of the same things as Endpoint Manager. So if you've got something on Intune or if you've got something on Endpoint Manager, you can go and use these platforms to install things on these devices. So with that in mind, if something is on Intune already but not yet on Endpoint Manager, I could actually go and use Intune to go and drop the client file, which is technically an installation if you think about it. I can use Intune to go and drop the installation file. And once I've done that, then ta-da, the device will be obviously on Endpoint Manager. As simple as that, folks. And that brings us to the end of the second main section and to the third section of this course, which is the last section. The third section, folks, is called Enroll Devices using Microsoft Intune. So in the previous section, we spoke about Endpoint Manager, enrolling devices or getting them onto the Endpoint Manager side of the coin. Now we're going to look at the Intune side of the coin. How the heck do we actually get our devices on Intune? Now, I've kind of sort of given that away to a certain degree because quite a few times I've mentioned to you guys, if you want to manage something in Intune, you need to enroll that device in Intune. Okay, so what is our first topic in this section? It's going to be a short section since a lot of the stuff has actually already been covered by accident in the previous topic where we talked about endpoint and all that. So our first topic is manage mobile devices with Intune. More specifically, I want to talk to you guys about device management lifecycle. So I'm sure you guys all know that in all companies, each device, whether it be a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop, or a server, whatever the case might be, they all have a life cycle. So just like human beings, where we're born and then eventually we pass away and all of that, devices are kind of the same way. I know it's weird, but kind of. So at some point in the beginning, you're going to enroll these devices. These are probably going to be brand spanking new devices. And way in the end, you're going to retire these devices. So that's the end goal here. So managing mobile devices, like most IT management activities, follows a life cycle. The mobile device management life cycle contains 4 phases, of which I just kind of touched on 2 of them. The first one of those phases, and you might be able to guess this one, is something called enroll. That is where you go and enroll the device in question. So you probably already know Intune was originally designed to manage phones and tablets, but you can also use it to manage laptops and desktops. So enrolling is not just to go and enroll a phone or a tablet. It could be to enroll some sort of Windows device, like a laptop or a desktop. So what is the enroll phase? In the enroll phase, devices register with the mobile device management solution. With Intune, you can enroll both mobile devices such as phones and Windows PCs. Remember what I said? Windows PCs as well as mobile devices, phones and tablets. And when we say phones and tablets, we know it's not necessarily going to be Windows. This could be Android, could be Apple, could be Huawei's new operating system. You get the idea. Now, out of these 4 stages, what is the second one? You can probably guess the last one's going to be retire, because I kind of said that earlier, but what is the second one? The second one is something called configure. In this phase, this is probably one of the most important phases. This is where you or your fellow administrators will actually go ahead and configure these devices in the manner that they need to be configured. Could just be normal configurations, could be security policies. You can also go and automate administrative tasks, such as, for example, configuring the Wi-Fi. So just because you can go and configure the stuff manually doesn't mean you have to. There's a lot of things you can actually have done automatically, especially if it's something that's going to be the same for a lot of devices or for a lot of users, like the Wi-Fi. So if these are laptops, tablets, and phones, which generally have Wi-Fi capability, you can actually go and have them configured for Wi-Fi and have them auto-connect to the Wi-Fi. Doesn't mean you have to do that. It's just to make your life a lot easier. Now, our third phase, which I'm sure you guys cannot guess, but if you did, I would be impressed, is called Protect. In the Protect phase, the mobile device management solution provides ongoing monitoring of the settings established in the configuration phase. So whatever you've established in the configuration phase, that's what you're going to continue here on. So during this phase, you also use the mobile device management solution to help keep devices compliant through the monitoring and deployment of software updates. So what a lot of people don't know is in Intune, you can actually go and do something called compliancy policies. So I have the ability with these policies to go and scan devices in my environment. And keep in mind, these devices don't have to be at the office. I can scan them, whether they meet certain criteria. So if I want my people or my devices in my environment to meet certain criteria, I can kind of sort of force it down on these users or these devices. So to give you an example of what I would normally do is, if I don't trust people of the devices because maybe these devices I feel is unsecure, I can force these devices to be encrypted. They have to use encryption. I can force these devices to have a password. If they already have a password, I can force them to have an 8-character password. I can force them to be geographically speaking in a certain location. So if I'm uncomfortable with where they're accessing information from or where they're accessing resources from, I can force these people to be geographically speaking in a certain location. We don't do that with public IP addresses. So there's a lot of things you can go and do when it comes to compliance. Heck, this could just be normal configurations on these devices. I wanted to say PC there for a moment. It could be just normal settings, normal applications, you name it. So if these people have to have a certain application installed for whatever reason, not necessarily a security application, this could just be a normal day-to-day application they would use for their day-to-day work. If I know my users or my people needs this application, I can do a compliance scan to check if they actually have that thing on those devices. And if they don't have it, I can actually have it installed automatically using Intune. Yeah, it's pretty cool, doesn't it? If they have an application installed that should not be installed for whatever reason, maybe we don't have a license yet for this application, I can have it automatically removed. So there's surprisingly a lot you can do automatically. Now, our last phase here, folks, is retire. I'm sure you knew that already because we've said it a couple of times. So when a device is no longer needed or just plain out old, or when it's lost or when it's stolen, you should help to protect the data on this device. So if someone's device is just misplaced, you can go and do something called remote wipe. If it's stolen, you can go and do remote wipe. Although, in my honest experience here, I can tell you it doesn't really work. The first thing people do when they steal your phone is they normally go and turn it off. So if it's not on some sort of mobile network or hotspot of some kind, you cannot actually give it the instruction to go and remote wipe itself. But if it's just been retired, or it's time to phase it out, or it's just been misplaced, or someone resigned from the company, there's a pretty good chance you can actually give it the instruction to go and remote wipe itself. I personally would recommend you actually go and combine this with BitLocker. That's not an actual topic here. So if it's a Windows device or something, maybe you go and encrypt the device as well as an extra precaution. But Microsoft would like you to believe that this thing is all sunshine and rainbows, which is not always the case. So they believe everybody would just go and leave the phones on if they've stolen it. That's not how life works. We know people are going to turn this device off. And if that's the case, you're not going to be able to remote wipe it. But in the event of this device just being old, outdated, just being retired, you know what? You can actually go and use the remote wipe function. It works like a bomb. All right, moving on to our next topic, considerations for device enrollment. So it's not as straightforward as everyone would like to believe sometimes. There's quite a few things you need to keep in the back of your mind, so to speak. So the first thing I would like to mention to you guys is determine enrollment method. How do you actually plan on enrolling these devices you plan on managing? So whatever they end up being, whether it be someone's phone, tablet, laptop, or desktop, how do you plan on enrolling these devices? Now, yes, theoretically, it is possible that if you're about to issue someone of a new laptop or whatever the case might be, while it's still in your office, while it's still in front of you, yes, you can go and manually enroll this device into Intune. But very often you'll find that is not the way we go and do it, especially if we just gave everybody a lot of devices very quickly, or if someone went out and bought their own device, or they already had a device, when we started rolling out this Intune concept. What exactly do we do in those situations? So the first method you can go make use of is actually a very popular method, group policy. So with this method, if a device is already joined to your on-premises ADDS, in other words, your on-premises Active Directory, you can go and make use of group policy to automatically enroll it to the mobile device management concept. What Microsoft doesn't mention here is the fact that group policy is generally a Microsoft or a Windows concept. So it doesn't really work on Android, which is obviously Google. It doesn't really work on Apple. I mean, Apple and Android, they couldn't care less about Microsoft and their policies. So good luck trying to get that to work on an Android phone or an Apple phone or any other phone, device like that. So if you've got a Windows device, sure, it might work. Assuming it's been joined to your on-premise Active Directory environment, that on-premise domain, it might very well work and you can go and pull this off. If it has not been joined to your on-premise Active Directory, and more importantly, if it's not a Windows device, don't even bother. It's not going to work. Another method you can go make use of is joining Azure Active Directory domain. Now, the good news about Azure Active Directory, unlike the on-premises one, Azure is not limited to Windows and it's not limited to laptops and desktops. So Azure Active Directory, you can go and join phones, tablets, laptops, desktops. It doesn't have to be Windows. It can be Android, can be Apple's iOS, can be anything. And even if you go and look at Windows, if you want to go and join a Windows device to the on-premises Active Directory, this normally had to be a specific edition, normally the higher end editions, which is more expensive. If you look at Azure Active Directory, that doesn't matter. So even if it is Windows, it doesn't have to be those high-end, fancy, expensive versions. This could be like Home, Basic, one of the cheapest, lowest ranking editions of Windows. It'll still work. So you can configure integration between Azure Active Directory and the mobile device management so that when you join a Windows device to Azure Active Directory, it is actually automatically enrolled into MDM. A lot of companies, if not most companies, actually do that. So that if someone were to go and join the company's Azure Active Directory domain, that device ideally should be joined automatically to the company's MDM. Now, there are cases, yes, you are going to find cases out there where this is not implemented. And it's not normally a case of they don't know about it or they don't know how to go and do it. Some companies just don't want devices to automatically be enrolled in Intune. Instead, they would prefer to have more control over it. And that's because every company in the day is unique. They've got their own criteria. They've got their own unique situations. Yeah, you get what I'm saying. Another method you can go and use, which is probably the most obvious, is manually. So you can manually go and enroll the device into Intune using the settings app if you want to go that method. Probably the easiest way. You can use provisioning packages if you know what that is, or the company portal app, folks. And I'm sure there's quite a lot more. Now, other considerations when it comes to device enrollment would be determine devices allowed and criteria. So yes, I've given you a couple of methods to go and enroll them, but what devices are actually allowed and what are, or how do you specify the criteria, or what is the criteria you can actually go and choose? Now, folks, there's way too many for me to mention. I'm just going to mention a couple of totally random ones. You can, for example, go and specify a maximum number of devices that can be enrolled per user. So if you know for a fact in your company or at your client's company, a user has only one device or only two devices, you can actually go and limit this to one or two devices. I'm just thumb sucking and using number one or number two as an example here. You can make it any number you want. So if you need to have a minimum or a maximum number of devices that someone can go and use, sure, go and specify that. If you want to block or allow only certain types of platforms, you can do that. So if you want to block people from using iOS, or if you want to block people from using Android devices, you can do that. If you want to go and block them from using any other platforms that only allow iOS or Android, you can do that. So whatever floats your boat in your unique environment, you can do that. You can restrict enrollment of personally owned devices. You can configure this restriction for iOS, Android, Android Work Profile, and Mac operating system devices only. This restriction is unfortunately not available for Windows devices. So just like Windows has got a couple of benefits like group policies, there is cases where Android and Mac actually also has a couple of benefits which does not work on Windows. So you're going to have to go and sit down with all your stakeholders and decide what is it that you want, what is it that your company needs and wants, and then based on that, you can go and decide what devices you want to allow, based on what criteria do you want to allow them, Basically, just go and check your company's unique situation is what I'm saying. Lastly, folks, another consideration for device enrollment. This is the last one for this topic. Determine if enrollment is optional in your company or your client's company, or if it is mandatory. Now, there are companies out there where it's optional. People can go and choose whether they want to join it or not, depending on what resources they need access to and all that. Or it could be a situation where it's mandatory. So there's just as many companies out there where it's mandatory. If you want to access any form of company resources, applications, whatever it might be, it is mandatory that the device you're using has to be enrolled. If it's not enrolled, they will not allow you to go and use it to access company resources. Now, the reason why they make it mandatory, I cannot tell you. There can be many. So just for me to thumb suck it as to why it was sometimes mandatory for the clients that I'd worked with. If you go and enroll a device onto the company's Intune environment, I'm sure you've probably realized by now there's a lot of things I can see. There's a lot of things I can do. One of the things we can see is we can actually see if a device has been jailbroken or if it's been rooted. It essentially means the same thing, just FYI. Jailbroken is a terminology we use for iOS, Apple, and rooted is a terminology we use for Android, in other words, Google. So that is when you go onto this phone or tablet in most cases, it's probably going to be a phone or a tablet, and you go and, in a nutshell, unlock the hidden developer options. So just like on computers, where computers and servers and stuff has all kinds of hidden administrative tools that we technicians use to go and fix problems, phones and tablets also have all kinds of cool little hidden tools, so to speak. And just like you that know what those computer tools does, a phone technician knows what those tools do. Now, theoretically, those tools can be used for hacking purposes. I honestly, God, don't know how to do that. I'm not a phone or a tablet expert, but I know it's possible. And because it is possible, organizations don't feel very comfortable with people using jailbroken devices or rooted devices on company networks because it's seen as a security risk. And because it's seen as a security risk, we just don't allow them to access resources. So if I force you to be on my company's Intune environment, I can essentially see or scan or check if you in your device has been jailbroken or rooted. If it has been, I just block you from gaining access to company resources. If it has not been, then, well, you can access company resources. So it's just another way for companies to enforce an extra layer of security and protection. There's many reasons why companies will go and make Intune enrollment mandatory. That's just one of the most common methods that I personally have seen for companies. Anyway, folks, I hope you have enjoyed this module of the MD-101. I hope you've learned something somewhere along the line. If you would like to go and revise on a specific topic, like I said in the beginning of the video, there are timestamps in the video description down below. So if you're looking for something specific, by all means, just go use those timestamps. You can go revise on a specific topic. There's a reason I've put them there in the video description. It is to make your life easier if you need to go and recheck a certain topic because you didn't understand it, maybe you've forgotten, maybe you're studying for the exam, whatever your personal situation might be, I've put them there to make your life easier. Anyway, so before you guys disappear on me, please stay tuned for module 3. So if you'd like to know when I release that, remember to subscribe, otherwise you might potentially miss that. If you've enjoyed this video, or if you just want to do me a favor, hit that like button. And then lastly, before you guys disappear, I just want to say a special thank you to the sponsors of this channel, the PayPal, Patreon sponsors. Quite a few Patreon sponsors actually at the moment, and quite a few PayPal sponsors. Also want to say thank you for those folks that clicked on the thanks button below the video. And then also lately, the guys that's been buying me coffees and milkshakes, you'll find in the video description, there's actually a link where you can go buy me a coffee or a milkshake. I'll be honest with you guys, if you buy me a milkshake, I'm probably going to give it to my kids. So in advance, I'll be thanking you on behalf of my kids if you buy me a milkshake. Either way, if you guys want to sponsor the channel, thank you in advance for doing so. I hope to see you guys again in module 3 of the Microsoft MD 101 course. Have a nice one, guys.